I'm going to begin by posing to each of our panelists the first question, which is, what is the difference between movement building and alliance building? And what kinds of organizations tend to focus on building alliances? What do we mean by that? And what kinds of organizations tend to focus on movement building? Why that difference in terminology, and what does it mean for building better relationships between these groups?
In my world, I don't think of alliance building and movement building as kind of opposites or differentiated, but there are some important differentiations, some important things about these terms. I do think there's a pretty strong distinction between organizations that have a focus on organization building and those that have a focus on movement building, that's a pretty deep tension, maybe the most fundamental tension in American social movements over the last century or so. So I think it's important to keep that distinction in mind. There is an important distinction, I think, or a distinction that's sometimes used, kind of associated with Anthony Thigpen, between coalition building and alliance building. Coalition building is a more transactional process. We are really talking about aggregating power in a kind of structured way, and what's going on is there's a common goal, and you're sort of adding resources to that common goal. Alliance building, at least as Anthony and others use it, is a deeper process, more focused on sort of fundamental shared vision, shared values, and a kind of sharing of resources that goes deeper than just aggregating them, but that goes to thinking strategically about how different capacities, different kinds of organizations add up to something bigger.
I'll be honest, when I used progressive and when I began using the term progressive to describe the kind of things that I was either advocating for or trying to build coalition with, it was a substitute for words that had fallen out of fashion. So we used to talk about anti-subordination. We used to talk about anti-domination, and those words have now become kind of heavy and too laden with some of the ideas about what went wrong in the 60s and the 70s. Liberal kind of went out of fashion too. You couldn't even say that. I remember when liberal was sort of the soft version, and then liberal became the hard version. So then, okay, we started saying progressive, because then it seemed as though, okay, progressive was kind of tainted a little bit with that heavy kind of, oh, you're the crazy leftovers from the 60s. So then people started saying social justice. So I kind of saw them more along a continuum, at less than completely different types. And then my mind was really blown when I went back historically and saw that progressivism used to be associated with the idea of good government, but good government achieved by disenfranchising immigrants, people of color, pushing certain other folks out of the citizenry. So, and people thought that was progressive, right? Because these folks aren't folks who are qualified to take up the democratic project. So it just reinforced to me the idea that our terms often reflect the politics of the particular moment, and not really are they vessels for any inherent set of ideas. So I watch when certain words come in and out of fashion, and actually try to hold on to them as long as possible, because sometimes something is lost when you lose the ability to say, yes, I'm a liberal, or yes, I'm a progressive, or when you have to kind of pack your agenda into the language that seems to travel most broadly.
It was a meeting to discuss the tension between the African American community, our broader friends in the civil rights community, some in labor, some in other ethnic organizations, and the GLBT community. And then there were a group of African American GLBT sort of shared constituencies, okay, and they were there. We took the meeting outside of DC. I mean, we held it in Airlie, Virginia, because we wanted to sort of have geopolitically neutral turf where people could feel comfortable in being candid with one another. Candor, truth, honesty is a big problem in addressing tensions between those two communities. The meeting was called because we had seen evidence on the horizon that we were about to get our asses kicked in California and Florida in particular, regarding Prop 8 as it turns out, but there were real tensions. And it was based on a series of analyses, real analyses beginning with the 2004 presidential campaign, looking at Ohio in particular, where there was a real sense that tension around a marriage amendment on the ballot had contributed to the loss of that state in particular, and thus the broader campaign. When the meeting was pulled together, Donna had done some polling, and we shared that polling. But what we found is that there were real barriers to effective interaction. You can't organize around a sort of theoretical notion. You need a genuine case or controversy, and you need a sense of shared interest and concern, and that did not exist between the African American and GLBT community in a straightforward way. The use of terminology, the use of framing of issues had been a source of tension, deep resentment within the African American community for the use of the racial frame of injustice to address interests of the LGBT community. There was a sense of exploitation for purposes of advancing an LGBT goal with no shared interest on the part of really uplifting or working with the African American community for a broader goal. There was also a sense of, anger within the gay community that the African American community failed to acknowledge, GLBT members' presence within their own network of organizations, and there's a real tension. I think the lesson that came out of it is that you needed a shock like Prop 8, like Florida, to really begin to get the dialogue moving. Now that that's happened, people are coming to us asking us to facilitate that conversation, whereas before we had to drag them to the table, and there was extraordinary reluctance even getting them there to have an honest dialogue that would lead to a greater level of interaction.